The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar. And while we wish we could all be together here at AUSA, obviously those conditions are not possible at this time. So what we've done is we've crafted a series of events to bring you senior Army leaders, authors, and others speaking on topics of current interest to America's Army, all in a live interactive forum. We're very glad you've joined us today, and we appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our great nation. Joining us today is someone who is well-versed in the American military, Mr. Kevin Maurer. He's the author of Rock Force, the American Paratroopers who took back Corregidor and exacted MacArthur's revenge on Japan. We're also joined today by Lieutenant General Terry Wolf, United States Army retired, the director of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, and a senior fellow here at AUSA. He will moderate our discussion, and with that, I'll turn the floor over to General Wolf, who will get us started and tell us a bit more about our guest. General Wolf, sir.
Well, once again, General Swan, thanks. I appreciate being invited to serve as today's moderator, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you today for what promises to be a fascinating, and I mean a fascinating discussion. For those joining online today, please take advantage of Mr. Maurer and ask questions. You can do that by using the question and answer tab on the right-hand side of your screen to submit a question. After the author's talk, we'll take as many questions as possible. Also, if you look at the right side of your screen, you will see a Handouts tab, and you can click on the Handouts tab and take advantage of the offer to purchase Mr. Maurer's book. So what about Mr. Maurer? Well, he's an award-winning journalist and an author of numerous books, and I'll highlight a few. He's a co-author with Mark Owen of the New York Times #1 bestseller, No Easy Day, a first-hand account of the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. Additionally, of No Hero, the evolution of a Navy SEAL. And with Tamar Al-Houdri, a book entitled American Radical, Inside the World of an Undercover Muslim FBI Agents. And of course, there are numerous other books as well. You can Google them and see the different books that he was published about special operations forces in Afghanistan. Most importantly, he speaks with a great deal of expertise. He's covered the military, particularly airborne and special operation forces, for over 17 years, including being embedded in Afghanistan, Iraq, Haiti, and East and Central Africa. Kevin lives in North Carolina presently, so I'd like to happily turn the microphone over to him for about a 15-minute talk in which he'll highlight some really interesting thoughts about the book. Kevin, to you, please.
Well, let me just thank you, General Wolf, General Swan, for having me, and for everyone at AUSA for taking the time to learn about Rock Force and talk about it. I mean, I'll tell you, I've covered the 82nd. I lived in Fayetteville. I love Fort Bragg to this day. It's still, I got very fond memories, I think, as a lot of you do, about Fort Bragg. But I didn't know anything about the jump in Corregidor. The only thing I really knew was that they had a mannequin of one of the paratroopers dressed as he would have been at the Airborne and Special Ops Museum. So when I was able to write this book, I kind of jumped at the chance to dig into this. It's a Pacific operation, and you don't often get a lot of airborne operations out in the Pacific, and it's got some very unique qualities to it. So in this quick brief, I just want to kind of highlight a few things, highlight some of the folks that General Wolf and I will talk about in our conversation, and just give everybody sort of a primer, because if you're like me, you don't really know that much about Corregidor, and so I just want to kind of up our level here. So next slide, please. First off, we're going to take a look at Corregidor itself. It's an island about 4 miles in length, and it's shaped like a tadpole. Is essentially how everybody describes it. I spent months trying to figure out a more clever way of doing it, but the tried and true way is it looks like a tadpole, and it sits facing, it's in the mouth of the Manila Bay, right? The name Corregidor comes from the Spanish word for magistrate, and it started out as a volcano, and you can actually see the volcano rim. If you look at the island, there's another island underneath the kind of the bigger map here. So as the tail swings down to the south, that's the actual mouth of the volcano. And the head of the tadpole, if we're looking at the tadpole here, at the head, they call it topside. So this is an actual mountain at the head of the tadpole. So it kind of rises up out of the sea, and that they call the top of that mountain topside. And then they got the tail side down here, and in the middle you have this place called Malinta Hill. It's about right there by the waist. And so the two big geographic locations you need to know as you think about Corregidor is that you have this giant mountain head, and you have this little hump here, and then it sort of tapers out into a hill. Next slide. The story of Corregidor really starts in 1941. MacArthur's caught off guard with the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, and he's forced to retreat to the island. And at that time, after the Spanish-American War in 1898, the Americans had fortified Corregidor. It became sort of their Gibraltar of the Pacific is what it got nicknamed. It was one of the best duty stations in the Army, particularly for guys that were in the coastal artillery. So the island was built to stop ships from coming into Manila Bay. And so when the Japanese attack in 41, takes MacArthur off guard, and he tries to stop the attack in Bataan, which is across the channel. And then his headquarters and a lot of his troops were on Corregidor itself. Eventually, as we all know, they lose in Bataan. MacArthur gets to Corregidor, and where they're going to make the last stand until he's ordered by Roosevelt to leave, and he's whisked away by a flotilla of PT boats. And then the cordon sort of takes over, and they take Corregidor. The Japanese eventually land troops right there south of Malinta Hill, right there on the tail. They fight their way in, and Wainwright eventually surrenders, and the garrison is taken into captivity. That becomes kind of a stain on MacArthur. It becomes also a stain on the American military because it marks the first time the Imperial Japanese beat the Americans, and that was sort of unthought, that they would never lose to the Japanese. And now the Japanese have proven they can win. So, this just sort of is an albatross that hangs over MacArthur, and it hangs over, I think, the American military for a little while until 45. And if you go to the next slide, please, we'll see Colonel Jones here. Colonel Jones is an early adapter of the Airborne. He, West Point grad, he goes to Airborne school and then eventually takes over a unit in Panama, where he earns the nickname Panama Jones. But Colonel Jones eventually takes command of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, which becomes MacArthur's strategic reserve. And so he's the one that, as they're driving on Manila, as MacArthur is living up to his I shall return speech, he taps Jones to jump with the 503rd onto the top of topside, on the top of that tadpole head, and fight and take Corregidor back. Next slide. And so here we'll see the plan. This is the plan that Jones comes up with. And what he wanted to do initially was land. There's an airfield right here at the tip of the tail. He really wanted to land at the tail, but what he sort of talked out of it in order to land on top of on top of topside, because the idea was if you land on the airborne side or the airfield side, you have to fight over Malinta Hill, which is a huge fortified hill that's got a massive tunnel complex, and it's actually where MacArthur's headquarters was. And now is where the Japanese headquarters is. So you have to fight over Malinta Hill, and then you'd have to fight up into the topside here. And this is this would be a pretty hard fight. There's many ravines, and it's pretty hard a landscape to fight in, and we'll touch on that in a minute. So the idea is, instead of jumping onto the tail, they're going to jump on top of the hill and fight down. So they'll take the high ground, fight down. And then simultaneously, there's going to be some regular infantry that's going to amphibious attack right there at the waist, and then they will surge onto Malinta Hill. Now, just to be clear, the Japanese are arrayed to fight off an amphibious invasion. They've been told that they could get an airborne assault, but they don't believe it, and they are really arrayed now to repel an airborne invasion. And the unit, the Japanese are a mix of guys, including some sailors that were on part of a couple of the battleships that were sunk early in the war. They're here now on the island as well. Next slide. So the first wave, and this is something that I think airborne guys on this call will appreciate. They do it in a couple lifts, and the drop zones are so small. One is a small parade field, and the other one is a par 3 golf course on top of this hill. And this, if you, as you guys can see here, it does rise up like a head of a tadpole. And so what they would do is they jumped in 3 sticks, and there were 2 aircraft over the drop zones at a time, and they would run in circles, each turning opposite so that they wouldn't run into each other. And they did two lifts, simultaneously jumping guys in 3 different passes. Next slide. You get a good sense of here, and this is what it would look like as they were jumping here. They were jumping at 300 to 400 feet because there was a wind that was blowing across the drop zone, and they were afraid that they would get blown off into Manila Bay. Just to be clear, there were Navy ships patrolling the island to pick up paratroopers, but that was the main fear, which is why they were jumping so low and so close. So essentially, they would get out of the plane, they write about it. And the guys I talked to, it really wasn't much of a jump as much as it was a fall, because they just had really no time. They were out of the aircraft and then onto the ground. Next slide. Now, once they're on the ground, though, this is where it gets tricky. This is one of the nastiest 10-day battles I think I've ever researched. Reading the accounts, and I had the luck of talking to one of the men who jumped. I mean, this is a fight in deep ravines. It's a fight in tunnels and in caves, and it's pretty savage. Most of the Pacific was very savage in general, and the way that they fought, and it was, basically, I'll leave you guys with this. They tried to bribe paratroopers to capture Japanese because they needed the intel, and they just couldn't get it. Both sides were fighting to the last man and fighting to the death. Next slide. Rock Force, though, that's sort of the overview. Rock Force really only follows a couple soldiers as they jump. One of them is the gentleman in the middle. His name is Bill Calhoun. He's basically, for the shorthand, he's my Dick Winters. He's a platoon leader, and I was able to get from his daughter an unpublished memoir that he talks about his service in the 503rd. And so I'm able to really follow him intimately, and you get a good sense of him, what he's thinking. There's a part in the book where he actually wrote down what he was praying one night. And so he was able to really bring an intimacy to this battle. And I was able to couple that with Captain Bradford here. He's a doctor from Harvard who was in Australia and was treating injuries to paratroopers and realized that the airborne should probably have a battalion surgeon that could help them. And so he got jump qualified in Australia, joins the 503rd, and he is the 2nd battalion surgeon. And he gives you an interesting perspective because he's outside of the regular battle rhythm. And so he's able to collect stories from all over the battlefield. And so he is the point of view I used to try to give you a sense of what else is going on. And he's also a very good writer, and he's got a very keen sense of the human toll of combat. And so he's able to really give you a sense of what the guys were feeling and how they changed from when they initially landed to what they end up feeling when they get done. The last 2 gentlemen is PFC Lopez, Tony Lopez. I actually met Tony Lopez. I interviewed him in his home in Denver. He's since passed, but he has got a very important part of this battle. In particular, he ends up getting wounded, saving a comrade. But he was great in doing something that I think you all will appreciate too, in that he could really tell me the funny stories, the stuff that you guys probably talk about more than anything else. And he tells a great story about stealing supplies when they're waiting before they jump, and making apple pies out of stolen supplies. And then the last guy to the right here is Lloyd MacArthur. Lloyd MacArthur is awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in this battle. But Lloyd MacArthur is the soldier that is amazing in combat and a terrible in garrison. And he and Calhoun have a great relationship as you read the book, where Calhoun trusted him and really felt comfortable with him as the scout. And Lloyd MacArthur's got some natural talents that come through, where he just has this ability to lead. He's a former lumberjack. And if I made him up in a novel, the editors would maybe take him out because he just doesn't seem real. And yet he's such a great soldier. But he has this legend where if he gets in garrison for too long, he'll disappear and go find some other unit that's fight with them for a little while, and then he makes his way back to the 503rd. And so you open the book where you meet Lloyd MacArthur getting out of the brig or the stockade because he's in trouble. He'd gone AWOL, and then he had come back because he had heard that the 503rd was getting activated on a mission. So those are the men that you follow in this story. And I think General Wolf and I will talk a little bit more about the way that the story is told, but these are really the guys that you get to know, and these are sort of your unit mates as you follow them. Next slide. So General MacArthur, we couldn't really ignore him in this because he not only did General MacArthur love the Philippines, he loved the Corregidor. He had a house. He was very fond of the island. And so when they finally liberate Corregidor, he comes back to award some medals and really to see it and to congratulate Jones and the 503rd for pulling off this mission. But one of the things that I think you guys would appreciate and we'll take away from this is that as he's touring the battlefield, he says to his staff, he says, Corregidor is living proof that the day of the fixed fortress is over. And that kind of struck me because Corregidor was built to stop ships from entering Manila. It was looked at as sort of the jewel of the American military in the Pacific. And yet by the time we get to 1945, it's obsolete. The Japanese had proven that they could take it. They could bomb it from the air. And these giant batteries that they had constructed all over Corregidor were sort of obsolete. And what they really had become were bunkers that the Japanese then used to defend the island against the paratroopers. The next slide. And then finally, I mean, this is probably what everybody remembers from Corregidor is this ceremony where they hoist the flag up. And this was a big kind of I.O. piece because when the Japanese took Corregidor, they staged a ceremony and a picture like this where they rose, they took down the American flag and they put up the Japanese flag. In fact, though, the American flag had been already taken down before the surrender and had been burned, except for a few pieces that a couple of the POWs kept with them. So the Japanese staged this picture. They got some American POWs to stand there, and they did their own flag raising. So this was sort of, I think, kind of to cleanse that. They have their own ceremony. But what I think is most interesting is Bradford's watching the ceremony, and he says something. One of his friends says to him, well, that ends the story of Corregidor, the true story. From now on, it's a legend and belongs to the scenario writers. They'll make comic strip heroes out of the real men who fought here. I'm glad we saw our part. They have theirs. And I sort of, that was sort of a North Star for me. And it was one of the reasons why I wrote the book in the way I did, which is to really focus on a couple soldiers and really dig deep into their experience because of that quote. Honestly, that quote came in my research and it really informed the way that I did tackle this book. Last slide here real quick is, I'm sure you all are familiar that the 503rd is still kicking around. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a patch here. This patch, I'm sure you've seen it out out there as you guys, the 503rd served in Vietnam, they've served in Iraq, they've served in Afghanistan. They were featured in Restrepo, which is the fantastic documentary by Sebastian Junger. And then the 503rd is nicknamed the Rock Force, and they still wear this patch, which was designed by the men who I wrote about in Rock Force and who jumped on Corregidor. And Lopez was very proud of this patch, and he had a couple of early ones. But if you look here at the patch real quick, you can see that the shape of sort of this tadpole like shape with the eagle on it. So that I hope that gives you guys at least a baseline understanding of what we're going to talk about, and then I'm more than happy to take your questions and talk with General Wolf now at this point.
Hey, Kevin, thank you very much. And the slides are incredibly helpful to try to understand the geography of Corregidor and the complexity of the fight. I'd like to kind of, retain the moderator's prerogative and ask you a first question. And I'd like to go back to jump into the fight just a little bit. Would you talk, I mean, there was a through the book there, you captured and chronicled the difference in what different echelons thought regarding the number of Japanese on the island. And that played into, obviously, how 6th Army gave Jones the mission to liberate Corregidor. Would you also talk about the geography in terms of, you've talked about the drop zones and the landing zones, but would you also talk about these batteries, these old cannon, batteries which were designed to help defend the entrance to Manila Bay, but why those are such critical tactical terrain?
Well, to start, the 6th Army thought there were less than 1,000 Japanese, about 850. 503rd, when they were planning the mission, and as they got there, they were thinking it was probably closer to 1,400. There was some initial reports by the resistance, some of the guerrilla groups in the Philippines that were reporting increases in ships stopping in Corregidor and supplies and men. But when all is said and done, they realized that they had about little less than 7,000 men on there, and they jumped the one regiment plus you had the other guys. So I mean, it was like 6,000, almost 7,000. Maybe shoot. Now I should have had the 5. I think it's like 3,000. So it's almost double. Which it's interesting because there's a part where Bradford is talking to a new lieutenant who had flown in a bomber over Corregidor, because they did a lot of they softened the battlefield. They bombed it considerably before they jumped. And the new lieutenant says, well, I don't think there's anybody there. We haven't seen anybody when we flew over. And Bradford sort of just shrugs and kind of dismisses that completely. So I think the guys knew they were gonna see something, that these numbers were pretty off. But I mean, they were, compared to what 850 to 6,000, the intelligence was way off on that. As for the terrain, it's interesting. I went to Corregidor in 2019 and walked everywhere all these guys went. So I already had a draft of the book, and I sort of went through and walked it all in. And I got to go to Battery Wheeler, and I got to go to Battery Hearn, which factor into the book. And these are massive 2- and 3-story concrete bunkers, right, that were built to house these massive guns that would shoot, and then they would come down underneath so they could be reloaded, and they were protected from the shore, and they would rise back up and fire again. And so it's like jumping into a neighborhood of bunkers is what happened. And what the Japanese did is there were tunnels, there were ammunition tunnels, and they used these bunkers as strong points, and they were very successful in holding them. Battery Wheeler, I think, lasted 3 or 4 days, and eventually that ending is pretty terrible. That assault alone cost them quite considerable men, just to root them out. But to walk through these concrete bunkers, you get a sense of just how hard it is, and why the battle really turned into discover where these bunkers are, open the door, and if there's anyone in there, they would either throw white phosphorus grenades in there or put a flamethrower in there. They really didn't do any kind of CQB where they would go in and clear these bunkers, because it was just too dangerous. It was dark, and it was really well fortified.
Yeah, thanks. And would you also kind of highlight, I mean, Calhoun recognizes this the first day. I mean, he lands that first afternoon, and on his own, he does in kind of a leader's reconnaissance of, if I remember right, it's Battery Wheeler, right? He goes and recons this thing, and you talk about through his eyes that he sees this as decisive terrain, because from that battery you can look to the west to topside and the mile-long barracks where he knows the battalion and regiment are going to be positioned with their command posts. So the fight for these batteries just is intriguing, because Calhoun keeps getting told, go clear, at least the entrance to the battery, and do everything you can. It's a series of, each day he seems to get another task to go clear one of the different batteries. Would you kind of comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting too, because when I was in Corregidor, it's really overgrown now. But when you realize that when Calhoun jumped on it, it was the foliage was really burned down or wasn't there, so it was a different terrain. And Battery Wheeler sits right there on the edge of the parade field. and it has a big tower in the middle of it, a concrete tower in the middle of it. And if you could, that high ground there, you could shoot all down the parade ground. So it was a key piece of training, because anybody, you could hold it, you could actually then you could interdict all of the Americans moving around on the parade field, especially as they were landing. So he does that battlefield reconnaissance just to see if there's anybody there. He does find one paratrooper who was shot, and he actually writes his own casualty ticket. But he doesn't actually find anybody, and he comes back. But when he comes back, the Japanese now have solidified, because at that point the Japanese were still trying to converge back on top of topside. They had been caught off guard. They had arrayed their defenses to repel an amphibious assault, and now they were scrambling to get back up. And during that scramble, the commander of the Japanese forces is killed by some paratroopers who had missed the drop zone and were moving up a ravine. They caught the command group coming up, and they ended up killing the Japanese commander. And Lieutenant Endo, who eventually in the book leads the Banzai assault, takes over at that point.
One of the questions that came in from our audience today is it gets at one of the LZ questions, right? And the question from Dave is such that he says, I remember standing on the small field, which was the landing zone at topside during his visit to Corregidor in the 1990s. And he asked the question, did most of the paratroopers hit the target? Did they land on the LZ?
Yeah, surprisingly. And at that time, remember too, that LZ was pockmarked, full of craters, had trees, broken trees sticking out. So I mean, it was like jumping into a pin, like you're gonna. It was such a treacherous drop zone, but most people hit. I think I know 14 people were killed, and they had estimated 50% casualties, and I think the number was down really now 10% or so casualty rate landing. But a lot of guys hit. I think I'd be guessing if I gave you a number, but the number of missed drops were not as bad as they anticipated.
And you also kind of talked about the winds, right? Especially when Calhoun's company jumps, right? Because I mean, I remember reading that you said that the pilots had reported to Calhoun that the winds were up or 25 knots, and so consequently, then they had to they made they asked Calhoun, do you want to jump at 300 feet versus 350? So, I mean, and then you also, if I remember correctly, captured a couple of the individuals that were separated, were down in the ravines. Anything you'd highlight from that? So it seemed it was a pretty good jump, though.
I mean, honestly, for a World War II jump with those parachutes, I mean, it was an exceptional jump. And if you think about it, when you think of the 101st to 82nd jumping at Market Garden or at during the Normandy invasion, those are big drop zones. This is a very tight drop zone with a parachute, not like today where you can hey-ho and fly in, right? So it's really impressive. And I think it speaks to the training, and it speaks to the abilities of the American paratrooper, particularly early ones in World War II. And I think the American paratrooper in World War II is probably the best if you stack them up against any other country. And I think the jump on Corregidor is a testament to that.
A question came in from another member of our audience who asked, whether you looked at how members of the 503rd were selected in the first place, in other words. And so, how all that fit in the concept of airborne forces. I mean, I know some jumped at the opportunity because the elite unit idea, the other was because of extra pay. But was there anything else you could add to, how and why folks joined the airborne?
I mean, I think by and large, from what I would gather from either my own interviews or from my own, from what it's been written, it is extra pay and it is this elite unit. But I think that it takes a special kind of soldier to jump out of an airplane, and not because of the airplane itself. I always thought that might be the easiest part. I think it takes a special kind of soldier to jump out of an airplane with 3 days worth of gear and believe that they can win no matter what. And I think that comes from the training. And I think the fact that the training pipeline was similar between the 82nd, the 101st, and the 503rd, and then they all went sort of the same training and then got farmed out. I think it just speaks to the success I think you see throughout World War II with the American paratrooper operations, not only when they actually jumped out and fought, but also if you look at some of the conduct of airborne units during the Battle of the Bulge. I mean, they were instrumental in stopping that. And I think that speaks to that American paratrooper, give me my weapon and give me enough supplies to last a couple of days and we're going to stop them. And I think, I think that comes from training more than it's recruiting to some extent. But I think once you get them in there, you're molding them into that. And I think that training pipeline works.
Another question from a member of the audience asked about the Philippine resistance and whether that had any role in what the 503rd understood from an intel perspective.
They did have initial reports that hinted that there were much more people. There were far more Japanese defenders on Corregidor than they were estimating. But beyond that, I haven't explored. They didn't have any action on Corregidor itself, and I haven't explored much beyond that one nugget.
I'd be interested if you would talk, a little bit about the operational security challenges. One of the themes in the book, which came up a couple of times, was number one, that when Colonel Jones brought the leaders of the different units in to do the rehearsal, obviously it was in a very secure area in Mindoro, down by San Jose Mindoro, and there in the staging area. But equally important, they had, their maps were really pretty generic. They didn't have a lot of detail on them. And you talked in the book about, even the ravines, which were pretty critical, enemy avenues of approach, weren't named in any way, and no one subsequently named those. And then secondly, would you talk about the radio challenge? Because in the book, you talk about the fact that, because of operational security reasons, they turned off their radios at night, but that's when the Japanese tended to attack and tried to infiltrate their lines.
So yeah, two things. One, Calhoun complains almost immediately about the map. It's sort of pointless. And Paul Whitman, who's one of the best historians around Corregidor, has a map, and he showed it to me, and we tried to use it to navigate Corregidor, and it's worthless. It's all contour lines. You don't know what it is. And that's why they named some of these geographic locations with their own names, just so that they could try to at least get a sense of bearing on where things were. And when they asked for maps, and in particular, not only did they ask for geographic maps so they could get the names of the ravines, the names of the roads, they also asked for maps of where the underground tunnels were, because they wanted to know where those were and where the entrances and the exits were. And they wouldn't give it to them. They were classified. They wouldn't do it. So I don't have a good explanation on why. You'd have to, I can only imagine what the S1 shop or what the S2 shop wanted to do on that. But it's interesting that they didn't have those, and it's something that was brought up to me with Lopez as well. The SOP on the radios, I asked that same question, and the explanation I got was that it was SOP from jungle fighting, and that at night they turned off the radios because they didn't want them. They didn't want somebody to get on the radio and have it turned up, and then it gives away their position. Calhoun, though, is pretty adamant that he wishes that they had kept them on, because at the time there were American destroyers that were circling the island, and the maps did have a grid that the destroyer gunners had as well, so they could call in a grid and call in artillery support or offshore battery support. And so his anger is that if they kept the radios on, he could have called for support, and he desperately needs it about midway through the battle when he's in his own sort of defensive position on top of one of these batteries, on top of one of the battery magazines, trying to hold off a Japanese banzai attack. And if he had the ability to call, because he could see the destroyers out there because they were firing star shells, which helped him, but he would have liked something else a little more potent.
I mean, what kept striking me every time, when I went chapter to chapter through Calhoun's fight with you walking us through this, I kept bumping into the fact that Calhoun is the most competent of the platoon leaders, obviously, and he keeps getting placed out of mutual supporting distance from his parent company, which is F Company, and his company commander, Lieutenant Bailey. And it seemed to me he was kind of reacting to that when he talked about the radios and the fact that he needed support. He needed naval gunfire. He needed close air support, and particularly after dark, things got worse when the Japanese attacked. Would you talk about the banzai attack by the Japanese Marines and Lieutenant Endo? Because there's a question that came up from our audience about the savagery of the fight, and does that contribute to some degree why more of these stories haven't been told?
I think so. I mean, I think it's the ugliest combat that I've ever really researched, in that both sides were fighting to the last man. The Americans had learned that being taken prisoner wasn't an option. And there was a sense of revenge after Pearl Harbor. And I think the Japanese at that Bushido Code, if you had an officer with a group of Japanese soldiers, that officer wasn't going to let them surrender. And so, you have these two, there really was no wiggle, right? Unlike I think in the European theater where they'd fight hard. And then when it was time to give up, for the most part, the Germans treated prisoners better than the Japanese. And I think that plays into it because it's hard to read, because Americans, when you read contemporary writing from these veterans, and even when I went to Corregidor and talked to some of the tour guides about veterans that had come through Corregidor since then, the hatred for the Japanese was still palpable. There's a Japanese memorial garden on Corregidor that was vandalized a couple times by veterans of the Pacific Theater who just couldn't bring themselves to be in a garden that was commemorating Japanese defenders. And there are two tours on Corregidor. You have the Japanese tour and you have the Western Allies tour. So I think there really still is a lot to that. And I think that's part of the reason why there isn't that much written about it. To get to your other question about Calhoun, I think Calhoun is by far the best platoon leader there. I think Ed Flash was really good, but he gets wounded and he exits the battle fairly early. But Calhoun, I think, understood his job, and when they're pushing out essentially right before the Bonds attack, they're trying to expand their white space, and what happens is Jones overextends everybody. And so he tries to pull guys back in before it gets dark, because when it gets dark, they're just going to stay in place. And so Calhoun initially is sent out to one battery and he starts to dig in, but then Bailey calls him again and sends him back. So he digs in on this place called Battery Hearn. And I got the chance to stand in the crater where I think Calhoun orchestrates the defense of this area. And it's really at a crossroads. And I can see why Bailey wanted to pull him back, because Bailey's Hill, if you're looking at Battery Hearn from the top of the magazine, to your right up that hill was where Bailey's Hill was. And I could see where he thought he could help, but he really couldn't. But that area right there, Battery Hearn, was really at a crossroads. And they were right to pick it, because what happens is about that night, the Japanese march like a Civil War army up this hill, waiting to assault topside, because Lieutenant Endo has marshaled all his guys, and his idea is they're going to try to break the line and push the paratroopers off and scatter them, because that's the only way they're going to be able to hold Corregidor. And so that's where this battle really comes to a head. Calhoun described it as a night of 1,000 hours, and I wanted to name the book The Night of 1,000 Hours, but I lost to the publisher who wanted to call it Rock Force. So with that said, that is probably the climax of the book, and I think that is where I think General Wolf, when you say that you see a lot, you've got a kinship with him, is I think you see him being, one, a great tactician, one, being very level-headed in during this combat, but also I think you see how serious he was about the mantle of command and how important it was to take care of his soldiers, and the way that he fights that battle, I think is admirable.
One of our audience members asked about kind of centralized versus decentralized command, and as much as you've portrayed it as a mix of both, it seems to me that Calhoun looked at this through a very decentralized kind of, if you will, perspective, right? He's the guy who keeps getting pushed out to right on the edge of, the edge of darkness, right? And he keeps getting left out there. Are there any thoughts that you have about, as you looked at Calhoun's manuscript, how he reacted to that? He obviously recognized that, and he recognized fighters, because the MacArthurs and a couple of the other characters are kind of misfits, but he brought them in because he knew he was going to need fighters for the tasks at hand.
I mean, I think Calhoun would do well in our modern army, because he had initiative. He understood, like you said, he understood how to put together a good team. He seemed to have a good idea of the big picture on why he was doing the things, but he also was meticulous in setting the defenses and doing the little tactical things, I think, that keep guys alive. I'm really impressed. I loved Calhoun. I never met him. He had passed long before I got on this project, but I did get into his house. I got to see his car. He's got a really old car, and I sat with his daughter for a long time, and she gave me full access to all his papers. So I got a real sense of his love, and we were talking before the presentation today, and one of the things she told me was, I think Calhoun found a home in the Army. He really loved being with the guys. He loved his men, and he loved being a soldier. And I think that comes out. And I think when you love your job and you love what you do, it shows in the way you do it. And I think, this is one of the hardest jobs in the world. But I think he does it with grace and empathy and skill. And I think he's a commander that probably deserves more than he gets.
There were two instances where, and you write about it, about two of the tunnels getting blown up. One, the Navy Intercept Tunnel, and then Matalina Tunnel, I think. One of our audience members asked about, engineers being involved in the breaching of Japanese defenses, and I think that's where this question is trying to focus us. Anything you'd like to highlight about those two tunnels, and kind of the losses, right? Because the losses were staggering to the good guys, to the 503rd.
Right. Engineers were key. They were a key part of this battle because of the fact that because of the fortifications, and it was up to them to breach these fortifications and to and what you find is that they realized early on, like we said earlier, that going into those tunnels and rooting out the Japanese is not viable. It's just not a good tactic. It's going to cost a lot of soldiers. So they really revert to blowing the tunnels up, either putting gas down the vents and then trying to use white phosphorus or flamethrowers to burn the Japanese out. And it's a horrific way to fight. One of the things that I wanted early on to try to get a Japanese point of view into this book, because I thought it'd be interesting to see the way the Japanese saw us during this battle. And I wasn't able to fully get there, but I did. There was this guy, Dan King, is a historian who specializes in Imperial Japanese. And he found a small, 5-page kind of vignette of this one guy who survives. And I think his story I was able to get in towards the end of the book. And you get a sense, too, of just how badly supplied, how badly led the Japanese defenders were. And yet they just never gave up. When MacArthur leaves Corregidor at the end of the battle, they still find a sniper who was still, out in, still looking and still fighting. So I don't know if I answered that, but
that's incredibly helpful. And I know you talked about in the book the losses that they encountered with the tunnel down on the end of the tadpole into the island, and I think 80 some or 50 some killed when that tunnel blew up. So. And those are losses of good guys, not counting the number of Japanese that may have been in the tunnel. I'd like to finish with kind of a dual-edged question. It gets at MacArthur, right? And so two of our audience members have asked about that. The first question about MacArthur was, did MacArthur's knowledge of the island kind of play into the mission planning? Kruger, as you highlighted, there were 3 LZs, drop zones that were in place, and Kruger, 6th Army commander, I think, picked the 2 that they used. Mm-hmm. And then, so the question is, did MacArthur's knowledge play into that? And the second question from one of our audience members, who stated that he had served in the 11th Airborne, and several members of the 503rd were in his company, and they, one of them was wounded and missed the DZ. And the challenge is, in retrospect, they blame MacArthur for grandstanding, right? And you talked about MacArthur's legacy being tied to this fight, and to some degree, was Corregidor necessary, right? Because it was a significant loss of forces. This had been MacArthur's strategic reserve, and he employed it to get back this icon, Corregidor, which MacArthur said he would never leave, but then he said he would return to, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor as kind of as a way to buck up American forces in the Pacific based on the losses in 1941 into 1942. Pretty complicated question. I apologize for that.
No, it's a good question, because I think it gets to something, and I'll try to do my best to answer it. But I don't know. I wasn't that interested in MacArthur. The book will tell you otherwise. The cover will tell you otherwise. The subtitle will tell you otherwise. I I didn't really want that subtitle for this very reason. I'm not as interested in the generals. I'm not as interested I'm interested in the guys that have to execute the general's vision. And so that's why I tried to write it as close to the action as I could. And I tried to pick only a few guys. And I really didn't want to go beyond captain, because I wanted to hear the story from the doers. The guys that were like Calhoun, who were out in front that night. But I think MacArthur's complicated, because I think guys were angry. I know I've read a couple accounts. Guys were insulted by the way he acted. But I think MacArthur was an old school general in a war that was ushering new school generals, right? Like, if you compare the way MacArthur still wanted to be, Napoleon. And I think you get guys like Patton who they don't want to be Napoleon. They want to be in it, right? Or guys like Ridgway who jump. And I think that's the problem, is that MacArthur was a man out of his era. And I think that's why he's portrayed the way he is. And I think MacArthur's. I've got more problems with MacArthur in Korea than I do in World War II. If that's what's diplomatic, I guess I can get. As for what was the other question?
The other issue is whether MacArthur's knowledge of the island really played into any of the mission planning. You could say obviously not, based on kind of what happened.
Yeah, I doubt it, and I've not read a lot where MacArthur was a real meticulous planner. I also the question if it was necessary or not. In hindsight, maybe not. I mean, I don't know what kind of threat you would get, especially you could cut that island off and starve it out pretty easily. So from that idea, I think you could argue no. But I think if you're a Navy commander and you got to go through Manila Bay to start getting ready to take an invasion into mainland Japan, you're not going to be comfortable if the Japanese control the island that sits right at the entrance of the and you got to sail all your ships past it. Plus, there was some concern about a string of mines, sea mines there that they wanted to disable as well. But I also I don't think you can discount the IO effect of the Japanese losing Corregidor, the way that they paraded it and celebrated it. I think the IO effect alone isn't enough, but I think that's an important piece of this, that taking back Corregidor was taking back some of the American confidence again. I mean, it's not lost on me that some of the paratroopers were watching newsreels of the Japanese and the way they treated the Bataan POWs as well as the POWs from Corregidor before they jumped. So I think, was it necessary? Would they have won or lost the war if they won or lost that battle? No, but I think it was necessary to take it back. I think it was necessary to secure the mouth of Manila Bay, and I think from an IO standpoint, it was necessary to sort of get that island back.
Kevin, thanks a lot. Well, unfortunately, we're about out of time. In fact, we are out of time. And I really want to thank you for this wonderful discussion and really for writing the book. And as I asked you, we were chatting yesterday a little bit about this, and I said, is it your version of the Boys in Company C? And to some degree, I think it kind of is. And if I could show you my book, it's just full of yellow stickies. And so the reality of it is I was so intrigued by the fight and the different aspects of the campaign through the lens of Lieutenant Calhoun and his platoon that I kept going back to different passages because it captured my imagination. Thank you for participating in this wonderful discussion with us and for taking such a wide range of questions. And really thank you to our audience for giving us a wonderful set of questions that I could amplify with Kevin. What are you working on next, Kevin? Can I ask?
Sure. Yeah, I'm doing a book called Damn Lucky. It's the working title, and it chronicles 25 missions from a guy named John Luckadoo, who flew B-17s in 1943 and early 44 for the 8th Air Force.
Fabulous. What's your intent in terms of trying to publish?
It'll be out January 2022.
We'll be looking for it.
Yeah.
Well, with that, I'm going to thank you once again and thank our audience again for being so active. And I'll turn the microphone over to Lieutenant General Swan.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much, everyone.
Well, Kevin and Terry, thank you again. What a fascinating discussion about a great book. And you've really made a contribution, Kevin, with this book to understanding our Army, especially during World War II. And for those of us at the Association of the United States Army, this is much appreciated, and thank you very much. Before we let everybody go, I would like to bring you up to date on some upcoming events here at AUSA. Our next AUSA noon report will be on the 3rd of February, and it'll feature General Christopher Cavoli, who is the commanding general of the re-amalgamated U.S. Army Europe and Africa. So that'll be an interesting session with General Cavoli, who will be joining us from Germany. On the next day, on the 4th of February, our AUSA Thought Leaders webinar will feature Ty Sedgley, who's just published a new book called Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause, a very timely topic, I think you'll agree. And then on the 24th of February, we'll host another AUSA noon report with members of the U.S. Army's Talent Management Task Force, and they're going to be talking about new initiatives in terms of enlisted talent management. So that'll be on the 24th of February. These are just some of the great speakers that we're going to be bringing you throughout the spring and the summer here at AUSA. For more information about any of these events or events coming up in the future, please go to ausa.org. And don't forget, March 16th to the 18th will be Global Force Next. This is the event we normally hold in Huntsville, Alabama in March, but this year this will be a virtual version of our Huntsville event, Global Force Next, 16 to 18 March. Go to ausa.org to get more information on that upcoming event. And finally, we want to thank all of you who support us at AUSA through your membership. Frankly, all of these events and the publications and products that we produce at AUSA are not possible without your membership. Your membership really matters to the Army, the soldiers, the families, veterans, retirees, and those who support us in the defense industry. So thank you very much for your membership at AUSA. So again, thank you, General Wolf, Mr. Maurer, for your great talk today, and have a great Army Day. Thank you.